By the time the owner's influencer son fired me on vacation, I'd been keeping his father's trucks moving for 21 years and I could hear the fleet in my sleep. Not metaphorically, actually hear it. The way the dispatch board sounded in my head, the rhythm of pings from telematics units, the soft thrum of the data center cooling the same way a big diesel idles when the driver doesn't trust the starter. The company was called Iron Grid Logistics, which sounded tough and modern on the side of a trailer. On the inside, it was fluorescent lights, stained carpet, and a server room that smelled like ozone, hot dust, and the dried sweat of every person who'd ever pulled an all-nighter in there. We moved freight across half the country, dry vans, reefers, flatbeds, thousands of units, hundreds of drivers, a few dozen dispatchers who did the work of 3 people each. On the investor deck, Iron Grid was a tech-enabled transportation platform. On a Friday before a holiday, in my chair watching the boards, it felt like a heart attack waiting to happen. The office coffee didn't help. It came from a machine older than most interns, a metal box with a burnt hot plate and a glass pot that had a permanent brown ring halfway up. The liquid it produced was the color of used motor oil and tasted worse. First sip every morning, it hit the tongue like battery acid and mud had had a child and fed it nothing but regret. It left a film on my teeth, a metallic bitterness that clung no matter how much you drowned it in powdered creamer. We still drank it because caffeine isn't a luxury in trucking, it's a safety feature. I used to joke that if the DOT ever tested the coffee, they'd shut us down before they even saw the logs. My badge said Director of Network Control and Systems Optimization, a title the owner's last consultant dreamed up to make me sound more expensive than my salary ever matched. In practice, I was the grid. I ran the Network Control Center, the NCC, a windowless room above the main dispatch floor, walls lined with monitors showing maps, ETA exceptions, weather radar, dot bulletins, and a rolling ticker of throughput metrics. I owned the TMS configuration, the telematics integrations, the ELD feed, and every brittle bit of glue code that made sure a frozen chicken shipment never ended up on a flatbed in August. The fleet moved because the machine moved. The machine moved because I did. Iron Grid was family-owned. The patriarch Hank had started with 1 truck and a bad back in the 80s and grown it into a regional carrier with a couple thousand units and pretensions of being asset-light because we leased more than we owned. Hank genuinely understood the business. He'd driven, dispatched, brokered. He knew what a missed reschedule fee did to a P&L. He also knew enough to admit the systems scared him. That's why he liked me. I spoke both languages, driver and database. Then his heart decided it had carried enough freight. He didn't die, but the cardiologist told him to step back. Hank did the stupidest thing a man like him can do. He believed his own PR and handed the day-to-day to his son. Tyler called himself Ty in public and content in his bio. He had a degree in digital communications and a modest following online where he posted videos of himself in Iron Grid branded ball caps talking about entrepreneurship and the grind. The grind, for him, involved ring lights and camera angles. He'd never set a 5th wheel in winter or tried to convince a scale house to let a driver pee before they reefer checked him again. He took over as VP of Brand and Strategy, which somehow morphed into acting COO after Hank's second stint. He came into the operations center in slim jogger pants, spotless white sneakers, and hoodies that cost more than most of my dispatchers' weekly take-home. On his wrist was a watch the size of a small saucer. On his face, neon white teeth, sockless ankles, of course. Executives with bare ankles always think they understand velocity. He loved buzzwords. He'd stand at the rail above dispatch, looking down at the floor like a general on a balcony, and talk about how we needed synergy between fleet and brand. He said we had to pivot away from old-school command and control and lean into visibility and optics. He used optics nearly as much as he used content. Everything was optics: detention pay, on-time performance, even CSA scores. He treated the FMCSA website like it was just another social media feed that needed curating. My first real run-in with him was over the Grid override. The Grid, capital G, was our real product, whether marketing knew it or not. When I'd started, IronGrid ran on paper and a freeware dispatch program that crashed if you looked at it too hard. Over the years, I'd built what we needed, a custom orchestration layer that sat between our TMS, ELDs, fuel cards, and GPS pings. It took real-time positions, driver hours of service, load commitments, service windows, and a half-dozen constraint rules and turned them into what dispatchers saw on their screens: green moves, yellow risk, red problems. It also had an override mechanism, a kill switch we'd built after a storm 10 years back left half our network in chaos and someone in accounting started manually changing appointments to make the reports look better. The override lived behind two-factor gates. The first was access, only the NCC had it. The second was physical, a 4-port hardware token wired into our core switch and bound to my fingerprint. Every 6 hours, the grid called that token to confirm that a human with override privileges was present and paying attention. If the check-in failed twice, the system went into safe mode. It froze new dispatch plans, rejected changes that violated DOT rules, and most dramatically, prevented the release of new loads from certain high-risk yards. It couldn't stop a truck mid-highway, but it could refuse to give a driver a new assignment or unlock a gate without a lawful plan. We built it that way because we'd gotten tired of sales promising impossible turns and ops quietly making it work by breaking rules. If someone wanted to push the system beyond safe, they had to literally put their fingerprint on it. That hardware token, a dull gray box with a single green LED and a fingerprint reader, sat in a locked drawer in my desk when it wasn't plugged in. It was linked to my biometric record and, per our insurer's requirement after that bad storm, had to be checked every shift. The underwriters loved it. It gave them a neat line in their risk files: Network Control Grid Override under Independent Fingerprint Authorization. The DOT never saw it, but they felt its effects. Our HOS violations dropped, our out-of-service rate went down, our insurance premium stabilized. Management grumbled occasionally about bottlenecks when we refused to override. Hank backed us. If Dahlia says the grid says no, it's no, he'd tell anyone who complained. That backing left when he did. Ty didn't like bottlenecks. He liked flow. He watched one of my controllers, a guy named Jose, push back on a request from a sales rep to stack 3 runs on a driver who was already flirting with his 70. Jose pointed to the screen, to the HOS bars, to the red warning. The rep whined about a VIP customer. Ty, listening from the rail like a cop with a scanner, came down and told me we needed to be more flexible. I explained slowly that the grid was enforcing federal law, not personal preference, and that we could flex .regs without paying for it later. He rolled his eyes. Other carriers aren't this rigid, he said. I told him other carriers also had worse basic scores and more accident payouts. He said, in that patronizing tone I'd heard on his videos, that we had to stop using compliance as an excuse to kill velocity. Then he asked what the override did. I showed him the box, but not the drawer it lived in. I explained the check-in cycle, the fingerprint requirement, the 6-hour heartbeat to keep the grid in active mode. I mentioned the insurer's underwriting condition and the clause in our policy that tied that control directly to our cheaper premiums. He half listened until I got to the last bit. So if the fingerprint isn't there, the system just stops dispatching, he asked. I said it paused new assignments and locked out certain yard moves, yes, intentionally. He frowned. That's a huge single point of failure, he said. What if you're not available? I told him that's why they paid me a director's salary and why they should have a succession plan. He didn't like that answer. The conflict simmered for months. Every time the grid refused to push a plan beyond legal limits, he saw friction. Every time I refused to manually override hours to shoehorn in more loads, he saw legacy thinking. He started talking in meetings about decentralizing authority and empowering dispatch to own the grid. He asked it if they could rip out the hardware dependency and move to a more agile, software-defined override. He didn't like that either. He hated being told no, especially by people who smelled like The Office and not like whatever cologne his brand deals sent him for free. The day he fired me, the air smelled like sunscreen and hotel AC instead of diesel and burnt coffee. For the first time in 15 years, I'd taken an actual vacation longer than a long weekend. A real one. A week in a beige beach town with too many kids and not enough decent restaurants because that's what my sister could afford for her family, and I went where they went. I spent the first 2 days flinching at phantom alerts, reaching for a phone that didn't buzz. By day 3, the sounds of the ocean and distant shrieks of children had finally started to drown out the hum of the network in my head. I was sitting on a striped lounge chair, legs stuck with sand, sipping something that at least tried to taste like fruit instead of battery acid when my personal cell rang. Iron Grid's area code glared up at me like an overdue invoice. I almost didn't answer. But you don't ignore that number when your nervous system has been wired to it for 2 decades. I stepped away from the pool into the shadow of a concrete pillar that smelled like salt and mildew and thumbed the green icon. It was HR, of course it was, not my boss, not Hank. HR reading from a script. They asked if I had a moment to join a quick call with them and Ty. No, I thought. Yes, I said. 5 minutes later, I was in a Zoom square on my phone, my own sunburnt face reflected back at me, the app's noise cancellation trying its best to pretend the squeals and splashes behind me weren't real. Ty sat in his square in what looked like the conference room I'd spent half my career in. Ring light set up behind his laptop, softening him, Iron Grid logo on a piece of merch over his shoulder. He wore a black t-shirt under a slim blazer, chain at his neck, hair perfect. HR was in another tile, expression blank in that trained way. Ty did most of the talking. He said market conditions were challenging. He said we needed to be lean and agile. He said new software they were rolling out, some SaaS TMS sold by a giggly rep who promised AI-powered dispatch, meant our network control needed to evolve. My role, he said, had been critical in the legacy era, but now the platform handled what used to be manual judgment. He said it like he believed it. Then he said the word, replaceable. Roles like yours are increasingly replaceable by systems, he said. We value your service, but we can't build Iron Grid 2 around individuals. HR jumped in with numbers, as if reading about my severance off a screen would distract me from the fact that my job was being erased by a man whose biggest risk was losing followers. 12 weeks' pay. Healthcare through the next quarter, some weak outplacement services. They said this effective date, that last day. They said my badge would be turned off by end of day. They said it would schedule the return of all company equipment. HR looked confused. I clarified, the hardware device in my desk that the insurer and our last SOC audit had loved, the one documented in a handful of policies his signature sat on. Ty recovered quickly, said it would reroute authorization and that modern platforms didn't need physical choke points. I almost laughed. You cleared that change with underwriting? I asked, blank faces. Those words weren't on his buzzword bingo. I didn't argue. There's no dignity in begging kids for the right to keep plugging leaks in a ship they've convinced themselves is unsinkable. I told them I'd wait for the paperwork. HR did the "we're so grateful" script. Ty said something about taking time for myself. We hung up. The call dropped me back into the sun, the smell of chlorine and sunscreen hitting me like a slap. My niece ran up, splash goggles askew, asking if I'd come in the pool. I said I would, in a minute. First, I sat down on the edge of the lounger and let the anger settle into something sharper. They disabled my badge before I left the hotel Wi-Fi. My inbox logged me out. My VPN connection dropped. The grid heartbeat that lived in a corner of my brain went quiet. For the first time in 21 years, I wasn't responsible if trucks moved or didn't. I thought about the hardware token in my desk, the fingerprint check scheduled to ping its little interrogations at 1800, 0600, 1200 every day, no holidays. I thought about what would happen if that call went unanswered twice. I thought about the clause in our insurance policy that said manual override of that safeguard had to be documented and approved. I thought about how much faith I had in Ty reading that clause. I did not drive back early. I did not call it. I did not remind anyone to update the biometrics in the grid. I had been removed from the machine. The machine would discover what that meant on its own schedule. The first sign came Sunday night. I got a text from Jose, my controller, at 10:43 p.m. It was just a photo, the NCC wall, a sea of yellow and red, overlay showing dispatch lock across half the lanes. Below it, his message, "They killed your login, tokens timing out, we're stuck." They say it's a glitch. I pictured him, headset askew, listening to drivers ask why their tablets weren't feeding them new loads, while Ty sat somewhere saying words like temporary issue into his camera for social. I didn't respond. I watched the ocean instead, waves folding in, relentless. The grid's first missed heartbeat would have been at 6, the second at midnight. After that, the system, doing exactly what it was built to do, would lock down. No new load tenders from high-risk yards without an override, no hose-violating manual assignments. No way to force a driver with 10 minutes left to head out on a 4-hour run. The system didn't know I was on a beach. It only knew that the one fingerprint it trusted hadn't checked in. Monday morning, my phone erupted. Unknown numbers, the main line. Hank's cell, which I hadn't seen light up in months. I let most of them go to voicemail while I drank coffee that didn't taste like burnt pennies for once. The messages told the story by pieces. Load planners couldn't release dispatches. The fancy new SaaS TMS Ty had bullied us into integrating with was spitting errors because it couldn't push plans past the grid's safe mode. Customers were on the phone asking why their loads were still sitting in yards at 7 a.m. Trucks were lined up at the Kansas City yard gate while the system refused to flip the gate status to green. You can have all the AI you want. If your gate controller relies on a status bit from a system in safe mode, your fleet is parked. Ty finally got through around 8:15. His voice sounded scraped raw, like he'd been yelling. He tried a tone of cheerful urgency. Hey, Dahlia, quick thing, the grid is being weird. We just need your help to, flip it back to normal. He made it sound like he was asking me to reset a router, not rearm a safety interlock he'd just fired me out of. I'm no longer authorized, I said. You turned off my access. There was a pause, the sound of him recalibrating. It can fix the access thing later, he said, slipping back to his usual patter. Right now we just need your fingerprint on the override so the system doesn't freak out the network. We're in the middle of a little optics thing. That word again, optics. Like CSA scores and missed appointments and idling trucks were a branding issue, not a physics one. Have you notified the insurer? I asked. Silence. About what? He said. I told him, in the same calm tone I'd used on nervous dispatchers, that until the grid override was either properly reauthorized or removed with insurer approval, any loads he forced through the system manually could be considered outside warranted operating conditions. If anything went sideways, accident, HOS violation, audit, the underwriters could point to the disablement of the control and walk away. The same control he'd been so eager to call a bottleneck was also the thing he'd been bragging about in renewal meetings as independent oversight. We've got 200 trucks sitting, 6 customers screaming, and a social media storm brewing. Drivers are posting videos from the yard. We need to get the fleet moving. That last part, the fleet moving, that was the only part of his monologue that still mattered to me. You need a consultant, I said. There was a beat. What? He asked, genuinely thrown. I can't touch your systems as an employee. You fired me. I said it flatly, letting the words sit. If I help you now, it's as an external consultant with a contract. And a rate? He sputtered something about loyalty, about the team. I'd been loyal for 2 decades on a salary that barely justified the nights and weekends. That tab was closed. This was a new one. What would it take? He asked finally, the fight bleeding out of his voice. I could almost hear Hank behind him, or at least the weight of Hank's expectations. Iron Grid's name was on the side of those trailers. Hank cared about that more than follower counts. $10,000 an hour, I said. 4-hour minimum per day, $200,000 retainer wired before I log into anything. Also, an email from your legal counsel confirming that I previously raised concerns about the override control and that my termination was not performance-related. Silence on the line. I pictured him covering the receiver, murmuring with someone in a conference room that smelled like panic and reheated coffee sludge. They wired the retainer in under 40 minutes. Desperation beats procurement every time. A generic independent systems consultant contract hit my inbox, PDF heavy, with a hastily pasted hourly rate. Legal tried to slip in broad non-disparagement and ownership of all ideas. I sent it back redlined, keeping what I needed. No gag on telling war stories with details removed. Explicit acknowledgement that the grid override hardware operated per documentation I'd authored. Indemnity if anything went wrong while I was in the NCC, then I went back to work for myself this time. The office smelled exactly the same when I walked in: old carpet, stale air, the faint sourness of anxiety sweat. The coffee, when I poured a cup out of muscle memory, tasted like burned rubber and resentment. It hit my tongue, and for a second everything was as it had always been. Then I remembered that every sip was billable now. In the NCC, the screens were a wall of red and amber. Safe mode active blinked in the corner, the grid's heartbeat messages logged one after another. Override confirmation missed. Override confirmation missed. Override lock engaged. Jose was gray around the edges, eyes red. He looked at me like people look at firefighters coming through the smoke. I told them not to cut your access before they touched the token, he muttered. I squeezed his shoulder. You were right, I said. You're on the record for that, yeah? He nodded. Always protect your people. I unlocked my old desk drawer. The token sat there, green LED blinking, patient. It didn't care I'd been fired. It only cared about fingerprints. I plugged it into its port, watched the grid's handshake request pop up. It asked for biometrics. I pressed my index finger to the cool glass. The system thought for a second, recognized me, and started unwinding its safe mode slowly, like a fist unclenching. Before we flip it fully, I told Ty, who'd hovered in the doorway in a hoodie and tennis shoes that had never seen actual sport, we're going to audit what you've been trying to push through. His jaw tightened. We don't have time, he started. I cut him off with a look I'd used on drivers twice his age. You asked for my help, this is what help looks like. Yard moves tagged as personal conveyance when they were clearly work. The kind of thing you can get away with occasionally in ones and twos, not at scale and not after you've told your insurer you have automated safeguards. The grid had blocked most of it. Enough got through in the first 6 hours to litter the logs with landmines just waiting for an auditor. We documented everything. That was my fee as much as the money. Every override request, every blocked attempt, every little just this once that would have blown up in a deposition. I made Ty sit in the chair and read out loud a half-dozen HOS violations they'd tried to cram into the system. This is what you call flexibility, I said. This is how you lose your operating authority. He looked like someone had finally introduced him to gravity. Once we'd quarantined the bad requests, I used my fingerprint again to bring the grid back into full active mode. Screens shifted. Yellow elongated, red shrank. Gate controllers unlocked within safe parameters. Dispatchers started assigning loads the machine could live with. Drivers stopped making tick-tocks from the yard and started rolling. The network side then started breathing again. The cost of the stoppage hit by end of week. We missed service windows. Customers yanked loads. One big retail client invoked penalty clauses for late deliveries. Another quietly moved half their freight to a competitor. Word in the industry travels at terminal speed, faster than fiber sometimes. The story that went around wasn't nuanced. It went like this: Iron Grid fired the woman who ran the grid, the system freaked out, the fleet stopped. The part about the influencer son, the fingerprint, the override design, that was just garnish on the corporate gossip. The board grilled Ty. Not because they cared about me personally, but because somewhere on a slide he'd made promises about modernizing ops and instead managed to deliver a multi-million-dollar self-inflicted wound. Hank, thinner and grayer, sat in on one of those meetings. He called me afterward. His voice was tired in a way freight never made it. Should have left well enough alone, he said. I should have listened when you told me to keep the grid where it was. I didn't say you should have. He already knew. They didn't fire Ty immediately. Family companies rarely do. They tucked him sideways away from operations back toward brand. Some press release went out about refocusing leadership. Internally, though, something shifted. People stopped pretending his buzzwords meant anything when the machine coughed. They started listening more closely when the operators and dispatchers talked about limits. My contract, on the other hand, got extended. Crisis consultant morphed into strategic network advisor. Big words, same fingerprint, better pay. I set my terms clearly. I would not be on call 24/7 anymore. They wanted 24/7 coverage on the override. We'd train a second authorized controller and get underwriting to bless it. We'd document it. We'd pay them appropriately. We'd bake redundancy into the override just like we did into everything else that mattered. I drew boundaries I should have drawn years earlier. It's easier when your hourly rate makes people sit up straighter. Sometimes, late at night, I'd find myself back in the NCC looking at the glowing maps, the fan noise like white noise. The room smelled like it always had, recycled air, a hint of sweat, the faint tang of hot electronics. I'd pour myself a cup of coffee and grimace at the taste. Still battery acid, still mud. The difference now was that each sip reminded me of an invoice, not a sacrifice. The grid is still there. The trucks still roll, the system still asks for a fingerprint every 6 hours and someone answer it. The hardware token sits where it always sat, unphotogenic and indispensable. Ty still posts videos sometimes, talking about lessons learned and resilience. He never mentions my name. He doesn't have to. The people who matter, the ones who actually keep freight from piling up in yards, who care whether a driver gets home for a kid's birthday, know exactly how close they came to parking the whole fleet for good because an influencer thought the machine would bend to his optics. He fired me on vacation over a call that turned my sunscreen sticky on my skin and made the ocean sound far away. My grid override killed their fantasy of being able to swap out the one person who'd kept the machine honest without paying the toll. In the end, they paid it to me. At $10,000 an hour and a cool $200,000 just to pick up when they called. In this line of work, that's not revenge, that's just finally charging what the coffee's really worth.